So we've talked about entities and attributes, and now we'll talk about relationships. So relationships are the representation of some association between entities. Usually in your requirements or scenario, you're going to find relationships by looking for verbs, but not necessarily. In the ER model, it's important to remember that we use the idea of relationships to associate entities. This might be surprising to some of you who have studied the relational model. In the relational model, we use attributes to associate entities, specifically foreign keys. But not in the ER model. We use relationships. The degree of a relationship tells us how many entities are related in it. Most commonly, that's binary, which means a relationship between two entities, but there's also unary, where an entity is related to itself, or ternary, where three entities are related together in the same relationship. Like with entities, relationship is kind of shorthand term for the idea of a relationship type or relationship class. A relationship instance is a specific relationship between entity instances. So it's kind of a shorthand for a more general term. And here's an example. Doctors work at clinics. So work at is the relationship between doctors and clinics. It's one of the relationships between doctors and clinics. So relationships have constraints. There's two types of relationship constraints. One is cardinality. Cardinality tells us how many instances of one entity relate to one instance of the other entity. And the choices are one or many. Then the participation constraint answers the question of, does every instance of this entity participate in this relationship? And the choices there are total or mandatory, meaning every instance must participate, or partial/optional, which means there may be instances of this entity that don't participate in the relationship. So looking at cardinality, there's three choices of cardinality between entities in some relationship. That's one-to-one, one-to-many, and many-to-many. So if we think about this, it's kind of a summation of both directions of the relationship. So if we have E1 related to E2, then if one instance of E1 is related to many instances of E2, so one, many, and one instance of E1 is related to one instance of E2 is related to one instance of E1, we have a one-to-many relationship. If it was one-to-one in both directions, then it's a one-to-one relationship. So one instance of E1 related to one instance of E2, and one instance of E2 related to one instance of E1, we get 1, 1. And then many-to-many means both directions. One instance of E1 can have many instances related in E2, and one instance of E2 may be related to many instances of E1. So if we have one to many going this way and one to many going this way, then it's many to many, many to many. So I use M and N rather than N and N, just to be clear that there's no suggestion that it's exactly the same number on both sides. It just means some number on either side. So Chen notation writes the numbers on the lines, whereas in crow's foot notation, we put the crow's foot on the N side and kind of a little dash on the one side. So we have the choices 1, 1, 1N, and obviously many to many looks like that. The participation constraint tells us about, does every instance of the entity have to be in this relationship? And in the Chen notation, a double line is on the side that it's mandatory for. So E1 must participate in this relationship, whereas E2 may or may not participate in this relationship. Now in crow's foot notation, we use another dash and an O for the participation, but it's a little bit hard to understand, and we'll need a real example from the next page. But you have a dash for total participation and an O for optional participation, but they come out on the opposite side that you see it in Chen. So it seems weird, but you will see why. So let's look at this example. So this is an example from our actual scenario where patients must have a primary doctor, but a doctor may or may not have a patient assigned to them as the primary doctor. And they may have many patients assigned to them as primary doctor. So here's how we express the two constraints in different notations. So first one, Chen. So one doctor may have many patients assigned to it as the primary doctor. And notice that this word primary, it's not a verb, just for shorthand, because we could say doctor is primary doctor of patient, and then it would be more of a verb, but let's just say primary. So the cardinality is 1 to n, because a patient is only related to one doctor, their primary doctor. Now, speaking of the participation constraint, we said a patient has to have a primary doctor. So in Chen notation, we put the double line on the side for the entity where it's mandatory, but the doctor doesn't have to be. So they have a single line on this side, and on the patient side, the double line. Now let's express these two constraints together using a range. In this technique, we say a range. So now let's think. So doctors don't have to be in the relationship. So reading this direction, we'll say a doctor is related to 0 to n patients, because the doctor may not have any patients assigned to it as a primary doctor. So 0 to n patients. But a patient has 1 to 1 doctor assigned to it as a primary doctor. 1 to 1, of course, means exactly 1. Exactly 1. So in this range, this 1 tells us that it's mandatory, and this 1 tells us the cardinality. Whereas on this side, the 0 tells us it's optional for the doctor, and the n tells us the cardinality. So now it makes more sense to see in the crow's foot notation. Reading the crow's foot notation this way, we understand that a doctor has 0 to n patients. So this is the optional sign, and this is the n sign. So this is the participation constraint optional, and the second part is the n. Reading in the other direction, a patient has exactly one doctor. So in the first dash is the participation constraint, and the second dash closest to it is the cardinality constraint. So we find out that for the patient, because we're reading this direction, it's mandatory in the first dash and a 1 for the cardinality. Now, there's one more thing to say about simple relationships. Relationships may have their own attributes, and that's one reason why I'm not showing any of the diagram styles that only draw the line between two sides. This just only line, it forces you to be clear. You want to put a word there, and it doesn't look so neat. And then if you have attributes on a relationship, well, it just won't work in this diagram style. So in this one, we use the same attribute drawing technique. So let's imagine that it's important to our database to store the date that the primary doctor was assigned to a certain patient. We need to keep that date in our database. So if we think about that date isn't an attribute of the patient. It certainly isn't an attribute of the doctor either. It's an attribute about their relationship, and you can even understand that from just saying it. It's the date that the patient was assigned a doctor as their primary doctor. So we can understand that that date is describing something about the relationship. So relationships can have one or more attributes of all the different kind of attributes. The only thing I'll say is that if a relationship gets lots and lots and lots of attributes and becomes quite complicated, it may not be modeled as a relationship. It may be better to model it as an entity. And in fact, I have an example of that coming up in the next discussion. How come a complex relationship can actually be an entity? So we'll stop there and come back with a lot of special kind of relationships in the next video.